Over the course of the Second World War, Germany built more tank destroyers than tanks, and almost none of them were planned. They were reactions. A new enemy tank shows up that they can't kill, so they panic, find a bigger gun, bolt it onto whatever chassis is available, and send it to the front. And what came out of that process ranged from cheap improvised junk held together with gun shields and optimism to some of the most powerful armored vehicles ever built. Some of those solutions were brilliant, some were disasters, and some were both at the same time. So today, we're telling you the whole story about them, one by one, all the way to the end. And it starts with a problem that quite accidentally created the first thing that would turn out to be the greatest tank destroyer of the Second World War. During World War I, every major offensive ran into the same problem. Infantry would go forward, they'd push through the first line of trenches, maybe the second, and then they'd stall, because the artillery that got them there couldn't follow. Horse-drawn field guns weighed tons, and they were trying to cross ground that had been churned into moonscape by their own shell fire. And the communication between the guys at the front, who needed fire support, and the gun batteries sitting a mile behind them was never reliably solved. So what kept happening over and over was that assault troops would advance beyond the range of their own guns and find themselves standing in the open against fortified positions. And they died in enormous numbers because of it. After the war, German officers spent years trying to figure out how the next war should be fought. And the idea that kept surfacing was that infantry needed its own armored, mobile, direct-fire support weapon, something that could physically roll forward with the foot soldiers. While they were building what would eventually become blitzkrieg, the Germans wanted to solve this specific problem with a concept they called assault artillery. And that's where this whole story begins. Here's the situation with German armor when the war broke out, because you need to understand how this system was supposed to work before you can understand how it fell apart. The Germans wanted one weapon to deal with enemy tanks and one to support infantry with high explosive fire. Two roles, clearly separated. The tank killer was the Panzer III. It carried a high-velocity 3.7-centimeter gun, the KWK-36, same caliber as the infantry's towed PaK-36 anti-tank gun. And given the armor that existed at the time, the 37mm worked just fine. The turret ring in the Panzer III was deliberately made large enough to accept a 50mm gun that was already being planned as the next step. The infantry support role needed a bigger caliber for high explosive power. That was the Panzer IV, which they called the accompanying vehicle. It was meant to roll alongside the Panzer IIIs and clear the path of everything that wasn't an enemy tank. It carried a short-barreled 75mm gun, basically a howitzer on tracks, designed to lob explosive shells into bunkers, field positions, whatever the infantry needed gone. And then there was the third vehicle, the Stug III. A self-propelled assault gun built on the Panzer III chassis, but instead of a turret, it had a fixed superstructure, a low armored box called a casemate. It carried the same short-barreled 75mm gun as the Panzer IV. Both the Panzer IV and the Stug III were meant to do the same job: blast bunkers, support infantry, keep pace with the advance. Basically armored escort artillery. The difference was how they carried the gun. The Panzer IV had a turret that could rotate and engage targets in any direction. The Stug III could only aim about 12 degrees to either side. Anything beyond that, you had to turn the whole vehicle. But no turret meant it was cheaper to build, it sat lower to the ground and was harder to spot, and you could put thicker frontal armor on it for the same overall weight. Trade-offs. So that's the system at the start of the war. 3 vehicles, 2 jobs. Kill enemy tanks, support your infantry. Logical and designed for a world where enemy tanks had thin armor and the 37mm was enough to deal with them. That world lasted about 8 months. The problem was that tanks were getting heavier and their armor was getting thicker, and this gun was about to earn itself a nickname, Doornocker, a gun that knocked politely on the enemy's armor, and nothing more. The first warning signs came already during the invasion of Poland. Some of the better armored tanks, like the French Hotchkiss H-35s that were present with Polish forces, took multiple hits and kept going. But Poland fell so fast that the problem was easy to brush aside. France was a completely different story. German anti-tank crews discovered very quickly that their gun was nearly useless against the best Allied armor. The French Char B1 had 60mm of frontal armor, and it proved almost completely immune to the PaK-36. There's a famous incident when a single Char B1 named Ure attacked and destroyed 13 German tanks, was hit 140 times, and not a single round got through. The British Matilda II was just as bad, if not worse. 78mm of frontal armor, more than double what the PaK-36 could penetrate at any range. German forces had to improvise. They used outflanking tactics and pulled 88mm anti-aircraft guns into the anti-tank role, because those were the only weapons that could actually kill these things. But the 88s were rare at the divisional level. They were huge, difficult to move, and they were never designed for this job. You couldn't hand every infantry division facing enemy armor an 88mm flak gun and call that a solution. Germany needed something better, and they needed it fast. Now, even before the French campaign began, German planners had already recognized that the PAR-36 wasn't going to be enough against well-armored French tanks. The 5cm PAK-38, which would have been a significant improvement, was still in development and nowhere near ready for mass production. So they came up with a stopgap. They took captured Czechoslovak Škoda 4.7cm anti-tank guns, which were available in large numbers, and they mounted them on the chassis of the Panzer I light tank. The Panzer I was already quite obsolete as a fighting tank at that point, armed with just 2 machine guns and thin armor, but it was also available in numbers. So, the concept was simple. Remove the Panzer I's turret, bolt in the Czech anti-tank gun on a pedestal mount, protect the crew behind a gun shield, and the result was the Panzer Jäger 1, Germany's first purpose-built tank destroyer. Now don't laugh at it. This was still the very beginning, and you're about to see just how quickly, and perhaps more interestingly, how absurdly this concept would evolve. The crew was 3 men, a driver enclosed in the hull, and a gunner and loader/commander standing in the open fighting compartment, exposed from the waist up behind a gun shield of just 14mm of armor. For German anti-tank gunners who had spent weeks watching their 37mm rounds bounce off enemy tanks, the Panzer Jäger 1 was, at first, a relief, but the problems showed themselves immediately, which you'd probably expect from pairing an obsolete tank with an obsolete anti-tank gun. The gun still struggled badly at anything beyond point-blank range. However, the idea of merging tanks and anti-tank guns was interesting, and the Germans were going to play with it and see just how far they could push it. The problem was that by the summer of 1941, Germany faced an anti-tank crisis far more severe than anything it had encountered in France. When Operation Barbarossa began, the invasion of the Soviet Union, German intelligence had almost completely missed the existence of the Soviet KV-1 and T-34 tanks, or at least their existence in any problematic numbers. They thought it would be a similar scenario to France, a small number of well-armored tanks that could be handled with tactics and air power, making up for the lack of penetrating power. They were wrong. On the second day of the invasion, German units began encountering something completely different. The T-34's 45mm of armor, sloped at 60 degrees, gave effective protection equivalent to roughly 90mm of vertical plate. German 50mm rounds ricocheted off at ranges beyond 500 meters. The KV-1 was even worse, 75mm of armor all around, and in some spots more, making it virtually immune to every standard German weapon. The 50mm gun, which was just beginning to replace the 37 on the Panzer III, was virtually useless from any angle against the KV-1. Soviet tanks were getting hit tens of times before something finally broke and made the crew bail out. There were numerous accounts of them advancing completely unfazed by anti-tank fire, destroying German tanks, driving over the anti-tank guns, and killing the crews with machine guns. It was a genuine shock, and the Soviet tanks were also in far greater numbers than the Germans had expected. So, here's what happened next. The 50mm was the absolute limit of what the Panzer III's turret ring could physically accept. By 1942, the Panzer III was a dead end as a fighting tank. It would continue in production for a while, and the final version ironically mounted the same short-barreled 75mm howitzer that the Panzer IV was getting rid of, essentially swapping roles and becoming an infantry support vehicle instead. Production stopped entirely in 1943, but the Panzer III's chassis, which was proven, reliable, and already being mass-produced, had a second life ahead of it, because that chassis was what the Stug III was built on. The Panzer IV, on the other hand, had something the Panzer III didn't: a larger turret ring. It had always been the bigger, heavier vehicle, and that extra space meant it could physically accept a much more powerful gun than the Panzer III ever could. The weapon they gave it was a vehicle-mounted version of Rheinmetall's powerful new 7.5cm PAK-40 anti-tank gun. And this gun could penetrate the T-34 frontally at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. The Panzer IV would go on to become the main workhorse for the Germans, the closest thing to a main battle tank in the Second World War. But that's not what we're here to talk about. What matters for this story is what the Germans did while the Panzer IV was being upgraded because the crisis couldn't wait. They were again filling the gaps with 88mm flak guns, which were again scarce and nowhere near enough to solve the problem across the entire front. They needed a solution now, and what Germany had right now, what it could produce immediately, were obsolete tank chassis, powerful anti-tank guns, and an already tried-out idea that seemed like it could work. When the Germans occupied Soviet territories, they captured around 1,300 Soviet 76mm field guns. These could be rechambered to fire the German Pak-40 cartridge, which had much higher velocity and was a genuine anti-tank round. They managed to do this, and the result was a gun that could destroy any tank in the world at standard combat range. That's one ingredient. The second ingredient was whatever chassis happened to be available. Captured French Lorraine tracked artillery tractors came in handy. The Germans had about 300 of those. Among many other vehicles, they were combining with either their own anti-tank guns or these converted captured guns, creating several sub-variants of the same basic concept. About 170 Lorraine tractors were converted with the 7.5cm Pak-40 mounted in a lightly armored, open-topped superstructure with a maximum of 12mm of armor. That was the Marder 1. The Marder 2 used the Panzer II chassis, another German light tank that had become obsolete as a combat vehicle. The Marder 3, built on the reliable Czechoslovak Panzer 38-ton chassis, was the most numerous version, and it was built in several variations depending on which gun was used and how it was mounted. The guns worked brilliantly, and they were a huge improvement over the previous door-knocking 37mm. They could now reliably kill any tank they encountered at significant range. But every Marder variant shared the same fundamental problem. The crew was exposed. The fighting compartment was open-topped, with thin armor on the front and sides, 10 to 15mm at most, enough to stop small arms fire and maybe shrapnel fragments, but nothing more. The crew stood in this open box on a chassis that was too tall, sitting out on the open steppe of the Eastern Front, visible from far away to enemy gunners. Any near miss from an artillery shell or mortar round showered the compartment with shrapnel. Soviet anti-tank rifles went through the armor like tissue paper. And don't even think about urban fighting, where someone could drop literally anything on your head from above, like here in Saving Private Ryan. So, while the Marder versions were yet another stopgap, the Germans now knew they needed something reliable and sustainable because Allied tanks weren't going anywhere. They were just getting thicker in armor and arriving in bigger numbers, and the Germans already had another vehicle in service that was about to prove itself far more suitable for the tank-killing role, the Stug 3 assault gun. The same logic that transformed the Panzer IV applied to the Stug 3, but with a twist that made it even more significant. The Germans developed the 7.5cm Stug 40, essentially the same weapon as the Panzer IV's new gun, adapted for casemate mounting with slightly modified cartridges for easier handling in the cramped interior. And just like that, the Stug 3 wasn't an infantry support weapon anymore, but a tank killer. And it brought real advantages. A silhouette of just 2.16 meters, which is about 7 feet. Thicker frontal armor for the same weight, because the armor only had to cover a fixed face rather than a rotating structure. The results were immediate. They began destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front, where the terrain was perfect for them, especially for ambushes. The Stug 3 would go on to become the most produced German tracked armored vehicle of the entire war, over 10,000 units built. And by German claims, it destroyed more enemy tanks than Panthers and Tigers combined. They finally had the right sustainable solution, instead of Frankenstein merging whatever guns and chassis they had lying around. But that doesn't mean they were going to stop doing it, not even close. Because what you've seen so far was just the warm-up. The Germans had stumbled into a realization that would shape the rest of the war. Mounting a powerful anti-tank gun on an existing tank chassis without a turret produced a vehicle that was cheaper, lower, and simpler than a tank. And in defensive combat, which is what their war was rapidly turning into on every front, it could be much deadlier. Germany would now pursue this concept across every available chassis and weight class. And the vehicles that followed fall into a clear pattern. Each one was either a reaction to a specific battlefield problem, an attempt to mount an even bigger gun on something that could carry it, or an emergency response to a production crisis. And sometimes all three at once. Now, the 75mm Pak-40 and its vehicle-mounted cousins were good. They could handle the T-34 reliably, and they could deal with the KV-1 at moderate range. But there was a problem with thinking that 75mm was going to be enough going forward. What the Germans could not guarantee was that these guns would kill whatever the Soviets fielded next. German intelligence was already picking up reports of heavier Soviet tanks in development. And there was another problem that no amount of 75mm upgrades could solve, and that was range. On the vast open steppe of the Eastern Front, engagements could begin at 2, sometimes 3 kilometers. And at those distances, the side that could kill at longer range had an enormous advantage. The 75mm L-48 was effective out to perhaps 1,500 meters against a T-34. Beyond that, accuracy and penetration fell off sharply. Germany needed something that could reach out further and hit harder, and the weapon that could do this already existed. It was the 8.8cm flak gun, the famous 88, the same gun that had been killing tanks since the Spanish Civil War and had proven itself the most feared anti-armor weapon in every theater where it appeared. The Germans already knew what this caliber could do. The question was how to get it onto a mobile platform in a form that was actually designed for anti-tank work from the ground up. The weapon they developed was the 8.8cm PaK-43 L-71, a dedicated anti-tank gun derived from the Flak 41, but with a longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity. With a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 meters per second, firing armor-piercing rounds, it could penetrate 190 millimeters of rolled steel at 1,000 meters, using tungsten-cored ammunition. It could kill any tank in the world, from any angle, at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Nothing was safe from this gun. The towed version entered service in 1943, but it had a serious practical problem. It weighed over 4 tons. It required a large crew. The troops nicknamed it the barn door because of its massive gun shield. Getting it into a firing position quickly under combat conditions was just impossible. You can have the best anti-tank gun in the world, but if you can't move it to where it needs to be and get it set up before the enemy is on top of you, it doesn't matter. So the obvious solution was to put the PaK-43 on a self-propelled chassis. And that is exactly what happened, but not in one clean, rational way. It happened in multiple different ways, on multiple different chassis, driven by different requirements, different political pressures, and different levels of desperation. The result was an entire family of 88mm armed tank destroyers that ranged from brilliant improvisations to engineering masterpieces to catastrophic failures. And sometimes, honestly, all three at once in the same vehicle. But before we get to any of those vehicles, there's something you need to understand about the gun itself, because it causes confusion to this day. And if you don't get this straight now, nothing that comes next will make full sense. When people hear German 88, they usually think of one weapon, one gun. In reality, there were two completely different 88mm guns, and the difference between them was enormous. They shared the same caliber, the same 88mm bore diameter, but that's where the similarity ended. They used different ammunition. They had different barrels, and one was far more powerful than the other. A Tiger 1 crew could not use the ammunition from a Nashorn or a Jagdpanther and vice versa. So here's how this actually breaks down, and it's simpler than it sounds, believe me. The first 88 was the famous Flak 18, the anti-aircraft gun that had been around since the early 1930s. When it came time to arm the Tiger 1 heavy tank, the Germans adapted this anti-aircraft gun to fit inside a turret. The result was the 8.8cm KWK-36, and the key detail is the cartridge it fired. The brass case that held the propellant powder was 571mm long. So, this is the 88x571 cartridge. That's the Tiger 1's gun. That's the Flak 18 lineage. And now, here are the tank destroyers that were armed with the PaK-43. Each one a different answer to the same question, which was how do you make this thing mobile and get it to the front? And then there's one vehicle you're going to hear about that carried something even more extreme, something that made even the PaK-43 look moderate. The first attempt to make the PaK-43 mobile was the Nashorn, and it came together with the kind of speed that only wartime urgency produces. A properly armored tank destroyer on a heavy chassis was still far away from production. They needed something now, built from whatever was available, and by now you can probably predict the formula. The solution was to take the recently developed Geschützwagen 3/4 chassis, which was a hybrid platform that combined components from both the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, and mount the PaK-43 on top in an open-topped fighting compartment. The vehicle was initially called the Hornis, meaning hornet. Hitler later renamed it Nashorn, meaning rhinoceros, because apparently he got to name things. What rolled off the line was, by any honest assessment, a compromise. The gun was magnificent. It could destroy any Allied tank at ranges well beyond what the enemy could effectively return fire. But everything else about the vehicle existed purely to carry that gun with the minimum possible weight and complexity. The armor was just 10 to 15 millimeters on the superstructure. The crew stood exposed from the waist up, and the vehicle sat tall on the battlefield with a high, visible silhouette. The same problems, basically, as the Marders. They'd already seen what happened when you put men behind a thin gun shield on open terrain, and here they were doing it again, just with a bigger gun, and the results followed the same pattern. At long range, on open ground, the Nashorn was lethal. Its crews destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, with confirmed kills at extreme distances, like a T-34 knocked out at over 4,000 meters. And there's a well-known incident among military history circles, the Pershing kill in Cologne, March 1945. A Nashorn destroyed the only M26 Pershing deployed in Europe at that point, at close range. So the gun did its job. But the moment anything got close, the moment artillery started falling or aircraft appeared overhead, those thin walls and that exposed fighting compartment weren't signaling a great day for the crew. So the next attempt went in the opposite direction entirely, to the other extreme. If the Nashorn's problem was too little armor, then the Ferdinand would have armor like nothing else on the battlefield, and the result would prove that too much of a good thing could be just as bad. The story of the Ferdinand doesn't actually begin with a tank destroyer requirement, but with a tank competition. When the Germans were deciding what would become the Tiger I, two companies submitted competing designs, Henschel and Porsche. And to keep it short, Henschel's more conventional approach won, because Porsche's design used a gasoline-electric hybrid drivetrain that was simply too fragile and complicated for mass production. It worked on an interesting principle where gasoline engines drove generators, which provided power to electric motors that actually turned the tracks. Elegant in theory, and genuinely interesting from an engineering perspective. But in practice, it was a nightmare. Unreliable, prone to overheating, and essentially everything you don't want on a battlefield. But here's where the story takes a turn. Porsche, so confident they were going to win the contract, had already built 91 hulls and chassis before the decision went against them. And scrapping 91 nearly complete heavy tank chassis in the middle of a war was unthinkable. So the Germans went back to their use-what-you-have approach, which by this point was practically a national doctrine, and converted them into heavy tank destroyers. A massive fixed casemate was built on the rear of the hull, housing the same Puck 43 as the Nashorn, but this time in a fully enclosed, heavily armored fighting compartment. The vehicle was named Ferdinand, after its designer, and Hitler wanted them ready for the summer offensive at Kursk, and every effort was made to meet that deadline. What came out of the factory was, by the numbers at least, an incredible machine. The Ferdinand weighed between 65 and 70 tons, making it one of the heaviest armored vehicles in service anywhere at that time. The frontal armor was staggering. The original Porsche hull already had 100 millimeters of frontal plate, and an additional 100 millimeter plate was added during the conversion, giving it 200 millimeters of frontal protection. No Allied tank gun in service in 1943 could penetrate this at any range, and the gun could do everything the Nashorns could do. On paper, nothing else in the world could match it. In reality, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. That same gasoline-electric drivetrain that failed during the Tiger trials worked no better under the stress of actual combat. The engines overheated in the summer heat of the Russian steppe, and Ferdinand became known pretty quickly as one of the most unreliable vehicles the Germans ever put into the field. It didn't even have a machine gun, no close defense weapon of any kind. You've built a 70-ton armored box with 200 millimeters of frontal steel, and if enemy infantry walk up to it, the crew has nothing to fight them off with except opening the hatches and shooting back with personal sidearms, which rather defeats the purpose of sitting inside a heavily armored box in the first place. On top of all that, every bridge crossing was a gamble with a 65-ton vehicle that most structures were never designed to carry. Every patch of soft ground was a potential trap, and if you did get stuck, no recovery vehicle in the German infantry could pull you out. A broken-down Ferdinand in the field was, more often than not, a Ferdinand you were never getting back. It was later redesigned with some improvements like adding a hull machine gun and more reliable equipment, and was renamed Elephant, to try to slightly clear its reputation of the worst German vehicle that was tied to the name Ferdinand. but it was basically the same thing. Now, while these heavy tank destroyer programs were lurching forward, a completely different kind of crisis struck closer to home. And this one had nothing to do with enemy tanks or insufficient guns. Allied bombers hit and destroyed the Alket factory in Berlin, which was the primary manufacturer of the Stug 3. The damage was devastating. Stug 3 production, which had reached 255 units in October 1943, collapsed to just 24 in December. This was an emergency. By this point, the Stug 3 was the single most important armored vehicle in the German army. Not the Tiger, not the Panther. It was the one vehicle produced in large enough numbers and destroying enough enemy tanks to actually matter at the operational level. Losing its main factory was a catastrophe that needed an immediate workaround. So Hitler approved a proposal to take the Stug 3's entire upper casemate with its 75mm gun and just mount it on the Panzer IV hull instead. Krupp was already building Panzer IV hulls, so the switch was relatively fast. The result was the Stug 4. A vehicle that was never planned or part of any long-term design strategy and existed purely because a bomb hit the right factory at the wrong time. About 1100 ended up being built by the war's end. On the battlefield, it performed essentially the same as the Stug 3. Same gun, same role, same effectiveness, just sitting on a different hull. Not the most exciting part of this story, but a perfect example of how much of Germany's war production was driven not by strategy, but by whatever emergency needed solving that week. If you're wondering how to tell the two apart visually, the easiest way is the road wheels. The Stug 4 had 8 per side from its Panzer IV chassis, while the Stug 3 had 6. So now we get to something different. The Jagdpanzer IV was not an improvisation. It wasn't a political accident like the Ferdinand. It wasn't an emergency workaround like the Stug 4. The Jagdpanzer IV was the first German tank destroyer designed from the very beginning as a purpose-built, fully enclosed, low-profile tank-killing machine on a medium tank chassis. And it incorporated every lesson learned from 2 years of combat with Stugs, Marders, Ferdinands, and Nashorns. Everything that went wrong with those vehicles informed this design. The result was, by most accounts, an excellent fighting machine. It sat just 1.85 meters tall, far lower than any tank on the battlefield. Its gun situation, however, was more complicated, and it shows a pattern that kept repeating itself across the entire German weapons program. The gap between what was planned and what was actually available. The original intention was to arm it with the long-barreled 7.5 centimeter L/70, the same powerful gun used in the Panther tank. But those guns were in critically short supply, because the Panther program consumed every one that came off the line. So the first Jagdpanzer IVs rolled out with the same gun as the Stug 3, while waiting for availability to catch up. And Hitler became so taken with the Jagdpanzer IV concept that he wanted to stop Panzer IV tank production entirely and switch every single chassis to Jagdpanzer IV production instead. But he was then convinced by the generals not to take away the only tank with a turret that actually worked and could be mass-produced. It saw extensive combat from the spring of 1944 onward on both the eastern and western fronts, and it was generally well regarded by its crews. In the defensive fighting that characterized the last year of the war, where vehicles fought from concealed positions and rarely needed to move quickly across long distances, the Jagdpanzer IV was arguably more useful than any of the heavier designs. Total production across all variants reached roughly 2,000 vehicles, making it one of the most produced German tank destroyers after the Stug 3. Now, if the German tank destroyer program produced one vehicle that military historians almost universally agree was excellent, it's the Jagdpanther. But then the question becomes, why did more Jagdpanthers end up destroyed by their own crews than by any enemy action? It combined a powerful gun, good armor, and the mobility of the Panther tank chassis into something that was, on those rare occasions when it actually worked and was available in sufficient numbers, almost unbeatable on the battlefield. Keyword here is almost, until it ran out of fuel or ammo, or simply broke down at the worst possible moment and had to be destroyed by its own crew to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, which happened a lot. The Jagdpanther came into existence while the Germans were trying to find the right platform for the Pak-43, and someone realized that the Panther hull might actually be the perfect match. The superstructure was a well-sloped casemate with 50mm on the sides, also sloped. Good protection all around. The Jagdpanther's combat debut came in Normandy in June 1944. The most famous early engagement tells you everything you need to know about the vehicle's potential and its curse. 3 Jagdpanthers ambushed a formation of British Churchill tanks. In a brief action, they destroyed 14 Churchills, while losing 2 of their own. And both of those losses came not from enemy fire, but because they broke down and had to be abandoned and destroyed by their own crews. And that really sums up the Jagdpanther. The planned production rate was 150 vehicles per month. Actual production never came close. Allied bombing, material shortages, and the demands of the Panther tank program meant that only around 400 were ever built, spread across more than a year of production. The vehicle didn't show up on the Eastern Front in any real numbers until January 1945, far too late to affect anything. And the Panther chassis, while good, carried a well-known weakness that was actually worse on the Jagdpanther. The final drive gears, which transmitted engine power to the tracks, were a known weak point. And because the Jagdpanther had no turret, it had to traverse the entire hull to engage targets. This constant pivoting placed enormous stress on those final drives, and they wore out faster than they could be replaced. Later, production vehicles got improved final drives that partially addressed the problem, but by that point the war was almost over. So, if the Jagdpanther represented German tank destroyer design at its best, then the Jagdtiger represented it at its most excessive. And honestly, that might be an understatement. This was the heaviest armored fighting vehicle to see operational service in the Second World War, and it was the only German tank destroyer that had nothing to do with either the 75mm or any version of the 88. Remember when I said there was one vehicle carrying something even more extreme? This is it. The Jagdtiger carried the 12.8cm Pak-44, a weapon originally developed as a naval gun and adapted for anti-tank use. The gun was enormous. The barrel alone was over 6 meters long. It fired 2-piece ammunition, meaning the projectile and the propellant charge were loaded separately, which required 2 loaders and slowed the rate of fire considerably. But the penetration was staggering. It could defeat over 200mm of armor at 1,000 meters. There was simply no Allied tank in existence or even in development that could survive a hit from this thing at any combat range. The gun was too heavy for anything smaller than the Tiger II chassis, and even the Tiger II chassis had to be extensively modified to carry it. Production began in July 1944 and continued through March 1945, but actual output was pitiful. Between 70 and 88 vehicles were completed, depending on which records you trust, and the weight was the core of every problem the Jagdtiger ever had. It weighed about 72 tons, powered by the same 690 horsepower Maybach engine that already struggled to move the 45-ton Panther. The gun, for all its power, created its own problems in practice. That massive barrel had to be locked in a travel position during any movement, because the vibration of driving would damage the elevation mechanisms and throw off the gun's calibration. But the travel lock could only be engaged and disengaged from outside the vehicle. So, if a Jagdtiger was moving to a new position and encountered enemy forces unexpectedly, the crew could not fire until someone climbed out in the middle of a combat zone and manually unlocked the gun. The Jagdtiger's combat debut came on the 4th of January 1945 during Operation Nordwind, and the very first Jagdtiger to be lost in combat, vehicle number 134, was knocked out not by an enemy tank gun, but by a combination of bazooka rounds and shots from an M36 tank destroyer that hit the vehicle's thinner side armor. The crew was killed. 250mm of sloped frontal armor didn't matter, because the threat came from the side. And that points to what was perhaps the biggest problem of all, the quality of the crews. By late 1944, experienced tank crews were dead, wounded, or in captivity. The replacements assigned to Jagdtiger companies were mostly barely trained, unfamiliar with armored tactics and psychologically unprepared for combat. 250mm of frontal armor is completely irrelevant if the crew doesn't know how to keep it facing the threat, and they often didn't. Roughly 80% of all Jagdtiger losses came not from enemy action, but from mechanical breakdown, fuel exhaustion, or abandonment by their crews. For every Jagdtiger destroyed by an enemy weapon, approximately 4 were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. And this just kept happening, over and over. A Jagdtiger would begin moving toward a combat position, break down en route, prove impossible to tow or repair under field conditions, and be demolished by its own crew. Now here's the huge plot twist, but probably not what you expected. After all of that, the final vehicle in this story is the opposite of everything that came before it. The Hetzer was small, cheap, and simple. It was produced in large numbers. And surprisingly, it actually worked. By the final months of the war, it had become arguably the most important tank destroyer in the German infantry. Not because it was the best, but because it was the one they could actually build. The Hetzer's origin connects directly back to the same crisis that produced those improvised tank destroyers at the beginning of this whole story. Factories getting obliterated by Allied bombing, and the Germans desperately needing to field something to fight the advancing Allied armor. So they went back to the same approach they'd started with, pairing whatever was left. Instead of using the Panzer 38T chassis for open-topped Marder 3 production, the new vehicle would be fully enclosed with sloped armor, a low profile, and the same 75mm gun as the Jagdpanzer 4 and the Stug 3. The official designation was Jagdpanzer 38. The name Hetzer was never official, but it stuck, and today it's universally known by that name. The vehicle that came out of this stood just 2.1 meters tall and weighed about 16 tons, making it smaller and lighter than most of the medium tanks it would face. The frontal armor was 60 millimeters, set at 60 degrees from vertical, giving it respectable protection from the front. But side armor was only 20 millimeters, which meant a hit from almost anything on the side or rear would go straight through. The crew of 4 sat in a cramped interior arranged in a row along the left side of the vehicle. And when I say cramped, I mean appallingly cramped. And despite all of its limitations, the Hetzer was effective in combat, especially in its intended role of ambushing advancing Allied tank columns from concealed positions with a gun that was still powerful enough to do the job at the ranges it fought at. By the final months of the war, the Hetzer was being produced faster than any other German tank destroyer. And in a war of attrition that Germany was losing, that mattered more than any individual vehicle's performance on a spec sheet. You can look at the entire arc of this story, from the Panzer Jäger 1 with its Czech gun bolted onto an obsolete tank, through the Marders, through the Stug 3 finding its true purpose, through the Nashorn and Ferdinand and their opposite failures, through the excellent but unreliable Jagdpanther, all the way to the absurd excess of the Jagdtiger. And it all comes back around to the same place it started. A gun mounted on whatever chassis was available, built as cheaply and as quickly as possible, and sent to the front because nothing else was available.